And just look like you've just arrived there, guys. 3, 2, 1, action. And roll. You got it, Rich. Okay, well done. We're done. You.
The last day on set. Everybody's looking forward to a holiday, except for those of us in post. The work's just going to begin.
We still have a lot more work to do, so we can't celebrate yet.
See ya.
So we finished the principal photography and then our pickup shooting in 2013. We were done, our actors were finished, but the battle didn't exist in much of a form even after we did the live action filming. And a lot of that was really shooting actors doing what I needed them to do for the storytelling without having a clue how exactly this was going to slot into the battle sequence.
So we didn't actually shoot too many components of the battle. We shot the dwarves starting to charge, and then, you know, doing their war chants. But we never really shot too much combat stuff.
Gives your battle cry, gives a big battle cry.
You tend to solve some of the bigger problems after you finish shooting, because when you're shooting a movie, you've got enough on your plate. You've got daily difficulties to deal with, and the actual planning and plotting of a massively complicated battle sequence is almost one step too many.
The whole battle had to be designed, it had to be structured, that all had to be worked on during the year that we were actually cutting the film.
The wonderful thing that Peter did way back in the Lord of the Rings trilogy was that he created these spectacular battle sequences, and people just really hadn't seen anything like this before.
For the Battle of the Five Armies, I'm not sure if Peter knew how he wanted it to be different, but he just knew he wanted it to be different.
It should be pretty epic. The way Peter described it is bigger than any battle that's ever been filmed before. We'll have 52 weeks to do it, and we will be cutting it down to the wire.
This was the last move in a master plan. A plan long in the making.
Can't just have shots of guys charging, waving their axes around, looking fierce. You need to sort of actually make it all a bit of a story, don't you? So, yeah, we haven't. I mean, the script doesn't have any of that at the moment, so we will certainly work it all up. We were originally doing 2 Hobbit movies, An Unexpected Journey, and part 2 was there and Back Again. But when it became 3 movies, the nature of the content of the movie had changed. The sort of the tone and the feeling of that last movie was different. This was a war film.
And is one of the reasons why we did break that little children's book into 3 pieces. The end chapters are very different tonally. They turn, they change, they take on a darker nature.
It's one of the things that makes The Hobbit a very interesting and unusual book, is there's quite a change of tone toward the end. Tolkien had written the death of Smaug, and then he stopped, and he changes his mind of how the story is going to end.
Tolkien found it very difficult to finish anything. Tolkien had to be urged to finish writing The Hobbit. His graduate student, Elaine Griffith, handed the manuscript to Stanley Unwin, of Allen and Unwin, and he was the one who said, yeah, we like it, you know, but can we have a finished version now? So Tolkien had to set to and finish it.
He rewrote and recast his ideas for the ending. Suddenly things get complicated, and it becomes hard to tell who your friends are. It becomes hard to tell who the good guys are. That's not the sort of thing you would usually put in a children's story.
It goes from being not so much a fairy story, but a legend, a piece of history, and that tantalizing hint of a greater world beyond this little tale.
The world of the last few chapters quite suddenly becomes much more archaic, darker, more heroic, more formal.
And they move towards the greater mythology that you find in The Lord of the Rings. It's interesting that Professor Tolkien did stop The Hobbit, where we were going to break the second film and the third film. And I think it was fitting and appropriate that that shift in tone was contained within this film.
I mean, the third movie is essentially about a battle, but Tolkien is fairly vague on some level with the battle because a lot of it's told in retrospect. Bilbo is knocked unconscious, he wakes up, and the battle's finished, and somebody says, oh, it's a shame you missed the battle, let's explain to you what happened.
The battle's, you know, it's only about 5 pages long. There's only one chapter that really covers off the whole battle.
So began a battle that none had expected, and it was called the Battle of 5 Armies, and it was very terrible.
Tolkien's reluctance to give us a blow-by-blow account of the Battle of 5 Armies is an open invitation to Peter to do something exciting and novel and different.
What was really lovely was when we actually had these big think tank meetings where we were trying to conceptualize the Battle of the 5 Armies.
We'd all get ready, and Pete would turn up straight off set, completely in the headspace of what was required for the Battle of the 5 Armies.
Holy God, okay.
This is a direct throwback to the way things worked on the rings, and we love this level of interaction.
I love that collaboration. I am happy to be part author of the screenplay, but it is a point when I want to open up the ideas to a lot of clever people that we have in the crew. Right, should we just turn those lights down a bit? Thank you. I like it. Michael's trying to get the best shots he can, and we're getting the lights turned down. That's good. Yeah, fire away.
Everyone would cram into this tiny little room. There was a huge number of us. It wasn't just Weta guys. It was stunt coordinators, Alan and John. It was kind of like bringing the cabal together.
And we did have a question about Gandalf's staff, didn't we? Because it was Radagast's staff that he's taken for this one.
Yes.
And just like Christian had suggested, we were thinking that he tries something and it doesn't work. It's the first time that Gandalf's encountered it, because it's a new staff.
There were certain things that Peter wanted resolved and hadn't quite solidified in his own mind exactly how he was going to go about that. And he was very, very open to ideas being put forward.
And you just look at the script and say, okay, here's what happens, but how's it going to happen? How are we going to surprise the audience? How are we going to shock the audience? How are we going to make it look as dangerous as possible?
Peter just wanted any ideas, all ideas, and we could just throw in, and, you know, we all had the same goal of making this battle work.
In that opening scene with the pots and pans, we see a level of dexterity that we don't have a payoff yet. I know. Because you could imagine in a battle their dexterity around, like throwing chainsaws at each other, type thing.
So the battle basically was invented in 2013 in those think tank meetings.
The thing that it does strike me that would be good to get more detail on and work in it would be any designs in the Erebor Valley where the armies of dwarves and the orcs are kind of clashing with each other would be good too.
Another idea that came about in the think tank meetings was what the actual 5 armies were.
Aye, the 5 armies.
We know there's men of Lake Town. We know there are the elves. We know there are the dwarves. That's 3. Those are easy. But then it gets harder.
Now, some people say we have goblins and then wargs.
So are the orcs and wargs one army? Are they 2 armies?
The bats, I think, were the bats the 5th army.
Do you count the eagles, or are they a 6th army? Is Beorn an army of 1?
Does that make it a battle of the 7 or 8 armies? I lost count then, but it sounds to me like we got more than 5, but let's put that to one side, never mind.
In the chapter describing the Battle of 5 Armies, Tolkien is specific.
Upon one side were the goblins and the wild wolves, and upon the other were elves and men and dwarves.
In the films, of course, they've shifted it, that you have the men, the elves, and the dwarves versus the goblin army led by Azog and the Gundabad army led by Bolg.
So anytime you're designing lots of armies, you obviously want to try to differentiate which army is which, because it gets quite confusing when you're starting to get all these different armies turning up.
One of the things I was so keen to get onto, in fact, I could barely contain myself, was actually designing armor concepts for the dwarves. The possibility of actually developing that culture so fully was really, really special.
I think Peter, from the get-go, he wanted broad shapes. He wanted, like large expanses of metal, or sort of armored tanks was kind of a term we used quite often in referring to these guys. Nick did these amazing, aggressive, powerful-looking, ferocious dwarven faces. And there was elements that carried through to the final design.
The thought of actually putting together the construction of this army was incredible. We had actually started the Iron Hill armour very, very early on and got a really good traction on it. Some of my favourite armour that we've actually designed. Well done, son. Good battle. Well done, son. But as the script developed, the Erebor soldiers started to take on more and more presence, and it became very clear very quickly that, in fact, we needed a significant army for the Erebor dwarves. So Pete made the call that the armour that we'd created for Iron Hill would simply be rerouted into the Erebor armories.
What was initially supposed to be the Iron Hill armour became the Erebor armour, and we needed a new army for the Iron Hill dwarves and something distinctly different.
We now didn't have an Iron Hill army, and in the 11th hour we needed to start thinking about this. Nick Keller once again stepped into the breach.
Peter quite liked the idea of working with a sort of just geometry of almost gemstones.
What Nick did is he started to think about the gems that the Iron Hills might pull out of the stone under their mountains, and the incredible talent and skill of an ancient race that could turn these crude chunks of rock into these extraordinary cut stones, and how that might be brought to bear in the armour.
That quite readily became sort of that iconic look for these guys.
That, of course, then developed into the helmets, and Nick played around with this quite a lot.
I was using a motif of the boar incorporated into the crest. We just had the three versions, so there was the basic infantry, the captains, and Dane himself.
You're just the meat inside the helmet right now.
We don't need no stinking helmets.
So we had another army of elves in this film, and we've seen armies of elves before. We've seen elves at Helm's Deep and in The Last Alliance fighting. The trick is, this is a new army of elves with their own distinct armor and their own distinct agenda, so there has to also be something very, very unique about them that, while they still look like elves, distinguishes them as Thranduil's elves.
But there were certain things that we kind of wanted to throw back to. The elvish design in the first Rings films portrayed more elegant Art Nouveau aesthetic.
Rivendell, where all the forms are kind of based on Art Nouveau, whereas Thranduil's has a slightly more kind of wild and wilderness feel to it. So we wanted to make it look distinctly different.
So we went back to the antecedents of Art Nouveau. That we found in a German photographer, Karl Blossfeld. This photography was exactly the photography that inspired so many of the artists in the Art Nouveau movement, and we were able to draw on ourselves a beautiful influence for that particular culture.
The elven armor and the elven weapons are all, very much inspired by Art Nouveau and the whole use of natural elements. I remember designing the shield, a sort of a Celtic Art Nouveau Greek shield, if you like. I wanted to get that whole period of the Trojan War, with the really big shields. And the Celtic influence was very much in the designs and the relief, like the famous Battersea shield. And the Art Nouveau, because this vertical asymmetry is something that you can't always find in period defensive weapons.
John designed that shield really early on, and it did have a heavy influence. The combination of the metal and wooden finish.
Because they're wood elves, we thought there was a real opportunity to use wood in an unusual manner. We were looking at the Japanese samurai armor, which is like heavily lacquered wood, and the elves do amazing things with wood. So to me, it's such a natural extension, really, of their culture. Is why wouldn't they use wood and treat it in a way that makes it as hard as steel?
Often the key thing in distinguishing a suit of armour is in its silhouette, and in particular in the helmet. If you can define a suit of armor by its helmet shape, then often you've found that iconic signature that will help make the entire suit of armor look different. So the key to cracking the elves in the third film was finding an iconic helmet shape that was totally different from Elrond's elves, from Galadriel's elves.
We had been very proud of the helmet designs that we'd created on Lord of the Rings for the elves, and we wanted to influence these helmets similarly, but simply couldn't copy them because they're of a different elven culture.
The Prologue elves and Fellowship have that nice, amazing vertical fan-shaped blade on their helmet. One of the things we played around with quite early on was what happens if we just take that similar kind of blade shape and put it horizontal to give them a different look, a little bit more of an Eastern look.
I designed the helmet so it was sort of almost a separate faceplate, came around at the cheek guards, and yeah, sort of fanned vertically, so you got the really strong silhouette from the front.
So we knew that in the Battle of the Five Armies we would need a new serious orc to contend with. These guys had to be big and bad.
We were told very early on from Peter that he was keen to try to make sure that this force was easily identifiable as a military force, and I think the example used was the Uruk-hai.
In the Lord of the Rings, we had kind of a super race of orc, the Uruk-hai, especially bred by Saruman.
And in terms of a piece of design, the Uruk-hai were outstanding. That was definitely one of the big challenges, was how do we come up with something that even better. We wanted to have that visual nod to the Uruk-hai, but we wanted them to be their own thing as well. So we looked at these guys being the antecedents of the Uruk-hai.
And so that was the main brief that we were working to. The idea that these are the pinnacle of orcdom, that they are the biggest, the strongest, the meanest.
So we thought that the Gundabad feel like they're the height of evolution as far as orcs go.
Even more kind of bestial and, you know, primal and violent, and more bullish, you know, sort of more testosterone-laden.
They feel older. They actually feel, you know, like another generation. Aged warriors that could still hold their own.
Look old, which is really good. It complements all the wrinkles, I know. You old geezer. They've got their conquests on their back. We like the idea that one of the evil armies would stack the trophies of the beheaded soldiers onto shafts of wood, and then, like a shish kebab stick with fruit salad and marshmallows, and depending on how skilled you'd been in battle, would determine how many heads you've got stacked on your stick.
I think if you want to do something like this, I think they should be almost made the length of the height of the helmet. Yeah, they just are a bit too twee. I mean, this particular design. We'll probably see you on the battlefield, Albina.
This is where John Howe really came into play, actually. Some of the graphic shapes, blade-like shapes that he designed for some of the helmets, we all loved.
I remember that whole idea of this sort of axe-shaped motif for the helmets came up really early. That whole idea of a weapon being part of a defensive piece of armor integrated in the helmets. It was actually some of the first drawings I ever did.
This very distinctive sort of blade shape became a signature look with these guys. They're a much more proficient armed force, and so their armor and weapons is a kind of reflection of that. It's meant to be brutal, efficient, and scary looking.
Whereas this is actually for just carving around the bone. Just carve around the bone there, just right around the bone. It just lifts right off. It's amazing. Dices, slices. The armor, that's extremely successful, and it carries the big blade motif. Everything about it suggests an aggressive demeanor.
We'd always considered that the Gundabads were a dying breed. They were the last of the purebred orc, and you know we don't see them in rings, probably because they've mostly been wiped out in the Battle of the Five Armies.
Very late in the piece, Pete realised that he actually needed another division of orc.
Originally, we just had the Gundabad army seen in Dol Guldur in the second film. That was what we were always designing and what we manufactured and built for. But from a script point of view, there was a bit of a change in the story.
There is a second army. Bolg leads a force of Gundabad orcs. They are almost upon us.
Gundabad?
We were trying to solve a problem. We needed a reason to get Bilbo up at Ravenhill. In the book, he really doesn't do anything in the battle particularly, so we always wanted to do something with him, for him to play his part.
You have to leave here now. Arzok has another army attacking from the north.
Which is why we had the hidden army led by Bolg descending from Gundabad.
Gundabad is a mountain in the north. It's actually where the dwarves first came from.
It was an old dwarvish kingdom which was then taken over by orcs.
And the orcs have built this sort of symbol of their power on top of it. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to have a fortress which is actually the shape of a weapon? So we have two distinct orc armies. One is coming from Dol Guldur, the other one is coming from Gundabad. And we need some way to tell them apart. So a couple of months before the film came out, here we were redesigning the Gundabad.
And the best way to make an army iconic is to design
the helmets.
And the actual design of the Gundabad army tries to reflect that blade-shaped motif, which is actually from the fortress itself.
That shape, that recognizable shape of Gundabad, the fortress, probably came out of memories of sketches that were done 5.5 years ago now, when the first orc armies were being designed. Everything kind of goes around. One iconic shape can end up reappearing and providing coherence and unity.
What are the orcs trying to do? They're trying to take the mountain for themselves, aren't they? So they're confronted, but they think they're going after dwarves, and then they find there's men there, and then they find there's elves there, and they sort of are just going to take on all comers, really. But there has to be a strategy to it. I mean, the battle needs... Just like we managed to in Helm's Deep and in Minas Tirith, we sort of managed to lay out a strategy which people kind of could follow in the movie to some degree.
Peter has a vast knowledge of war and battles, a very in-depth understanding of how to construct a battle.
He was making Napoleonic war films and First World War films when he was 8. He loves that stuff. You don't want to play Risk with the guy, not if you want to win.
Tanya and I used to go and attempt to play the game Risk against Peter and Fran. And needless to say, we never won. Peter would approach the game as if his life and the 100,000 men he led across Europe's lives depended on it.
It's all about formations. It's all about seeing that this army is lined up against this army. It's like, a big chess game on a vast landscape. You want to make it easy as possible for people to follow the narrative.
And we wanted to make sure that when the viewer was looking at wide shots, that they didn't just look at an ocean of individuals and not really understand who was where.
Because once troops start coming together, especially if they're fighting hand to hand, as you are in the Battle of Five Armies, it becomes this huge mess very quickly.
It doesn't have any rhyme or reason to it anymore, and so I wanted to avoid that. And so that's where you start to go into old paintings from the 19th century.
A lot of the paintings of the Napoleonic Wars are designed to tell a story. And so they were a really good inspiration because we needed to very quickly look at the battlefield and get an understanding of who was retreating and who was advancing and where the conflicts were occurring.
And so that's really what we took our inspiration from with a lot of our wide shots. The thing with battle scenes, too, is that you have to have a sense of geography.
In all of the battle scenes, he wanted to kind of establish the terrain very clearly. He did that with Helm's Deep in a series of shots where you really know the environment. And with the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, again, it was quite a kind of a simple setup. With the Battle of the Five Armies, it's a bit more complicated because there are also all these different elements.
Battle of the Five Armies I looked at really divided into 3 categories, which are basically location-based. And you've got the big medieval maneuvering in the valley, you know, the big formations maneuvering, charging down the hill and clashing.
Then moves very quickly into the streets of Dale and becomes like a street fight.
It's riot-style mob kind of brawling fighting, dirty hand-to-hand sort of street fighting. And then in Ravenhill, you've got a series of one-on-one battles for the most part.
So as we're cutting around these 3 different environments, once we learn the various looks of the places, we know where we are immediately, and we're not getting confused by which, you know, part of the battle we're seeing now.
In some of the think tank meetings, there was a huge amount of discussion about the transportation and how to get the orcs to the battle undercover.
This was to be a sudden attack. If they don't do this sudden attack, then our heroes look like idiots because they didn't see them coming. And so how do you do that? There's a very brief description in the book of the orcs' attack on the Lonely Mountain.
Then they marched and gathered by hill and valley, going ever by tunnel or under dark.
And Peter had the idea they should actually emerge directly into the battlefield.
So really what we're going to ultimately want is when these worms actually erupt out of the ground, we're going to want them to have a line of sight to where the guys are fighting. I mean, maybe even they come out of the ridge beside the dwarves, you know, so that they're getting flanked by things, you know what I mean? We can have a bit of fun with it.
My first thought when the term wereworm came up, I had to check the date to make sure it wasn't April 1st.
Oh, come on!
The idea of the wereworms is drawn from a line in The Hobbit where Bilbo just references them very briefly.
Tell me what you want done, and I will try it. If I have to walk from here to the east of East and fight the wild wereworms in the last desert.
One of Tolkien's unguarded moments when he used a word that is ambiguous. Did he mean by worm, did he mean dragon? Or did he mean worm in the modern sense? It's obviously a clear opportunity for interpretation.
We had to obviously avoid the Dune crossover, which was very difficult. But I think Nick Keller ended up coming up with a pretty good design that had a lot of twisting motion in it.
These were kind of playing to that idea of rather than just a linear motion, it's sort of a spiraling motion with a...
It's definitely a little bit different than I would have expected, but then when we saw the first couple shots starting to come through, I thought, wow, this is actually a good idea. Who would have thought?
By the time we had edited the 3rd movie, it now was a much more battle-focused film.
There came a point where I think it was obvious to everyone that There and Back Again wasn't a title that really represented the 3rd film. Nobody was going there and nobody went back again.
Once we saw a rough cut of this movie, I remember saying to the studio, I will be lobbying to convince you to change it to the Battle of the Five Armies. Warner Brothers were a little bit concerned because apparently in Hollywood you don't release movies with the word battle in the title. Apparently they don't do very well at the box office.
One of the major concerns we did have when cutting this 3rd film was a worry that the audience would suffer from battle fatigue. We had just to keep things focused on our characters and not let the battle just become a lot of hacking and slashing.
I try to think of the battle as being just a location for our characters. We try to always keep our character stories alive and flowing through. So there's certain rules that we give ourselves, like when we're in a battle sequence, we try to not go for more than 2 or 3 shots before we cut back to one of our main characters.
They're on the battlefield, but it's not just fighting, it is, dramatic scenes.
I think we always knew this film was going to be a war film.
I will have war.
And once you saw the rough cut, it was the Battle of the Five Armies. It's definitely, there can't be anything else. It just cannot be anything else. But the Battle of the Five Armies still had a long way to go to be created.
Here we go. You guys ready? And playback.
Good morning.
Morning. It's May 1st, 2014. We're on the last of The Hobbits, which was just renamed to Battle of the Five Armies.
So we know it's Battle of the Five Armies. We know there's 5 armies. We just don't know how big it is yet.
We had not shot the bulk of the battle sequence.
We'd obviously shot all our hero characters going through their journey. You take him out, but then there's like 6 of them running at the same time. But actually what the armies did and how they interacted wasn't really glued together.
And we've got 25 weeks to go? 25 weeks to go, I think.
This now goes to the wide shot, the crane shot.
So Peter's juggling his time between actually cutting the film and with reviewing the work in progress.
So fire away.
I sort of went into the year thinking we weren't going to have more footage coming in, and we really had a year of post-production. I mean, at least that's the way we thought it was going to be, but of course it turns out that even though we don't have one scheduled, we did have an extra shoot. It was just a mocap shoot, and there was a lot of footage generated.
Okay, should we start really cracking some off?
It'll run very much like normal pickups, but it'll just be all virtual pickups.
And action. And so 2014 saw a fairly intense period of post-production where we're not doing any more live action filming, but we are now creating a digital filmmaking studio, if you like, in the mocap stage, which allows me to keep shooting the movie in a virtual way.
And we're set, Peter.
Because I still have the AD, Emma Cross.
All right, here we go.
We've all been on the set for 2 years shooting these movies, and now we're just on a mocap stage, and we're still shooting.
Here we go. And roll, please.
And that's when the battle itself really started to take shape. By the time this DVD comes out, we'll know if it did come together or not.
The biggest challenge for us was really trying to grasp the scope of the battle itself. 25% of the actual film is full CG shots, which means no live action at all in the shots. And 96% of the shots in the movie had visual effects in them.
There's a stigma with sort of digital effects, and especially something like, you know, the films that we make. I mean, you have to have a lot of digital effects because you simply cannot recreate this stuff any other way.
So in a battle that was largely digital, you know, the goal is to make it feel as realistic as possible. Without the sense of realism, it's just going to look very fake. You're going to snap the audience out of this sequence, and we didn't want to do that at all.
The difficulty then is you have a digital world that is in the hands of computer artists. They can create these incredible images on a computer screen, but they're not used to a live action film set. They're not used to carrying a camera on their shoulder. So I wanted to make sure that we were able to support them with people that had real world experience. And so, you know, Alan Lee and John Howe come from just a pencil and a paper, but they're thinking of light. That's what they have to do when they're creating their artwork, their paintings. And so they can be a huge benefit to the CG artists.
We are painting out green screens and painting in backgrounds, as well as doing general concept work for many sequences. So it's quite a mix.
So preparing the whole environment essentially for that battle and for those actions has been the biggest part of the job so far.
And, you know, art director like Simon Bright, we put him into the digital world as well.
You're trying to apply your trade in the digital world of what you do, what you know best in the physical world. You know, I knew what we did on the day as far as shooting it and what sets were built.
I think they really wanted, you know, art directors from the physical shoot to bring that continuity of what we built into the digital side. Peter wanted a critical art director's eye on every visual effect frame that was coming through.
You know, even though we're creating a lot of these films digitally, the way we like to work is to go back to the real world and use that as a touchstone as much as possible. Creating the battlefield was originally to use some locations where we could stage parts of it, but it became apparent that we had too vast of a battlefield to find any one location. You know, a place that doesn't exist. There's nowhere in the world you can go to visit this location. However, there were lots of places, especially in the South Island, that had the characteristics of what we wanted the battlefield to be, Rock and Pillar being a good example.
What we had done on the aerial unit was go and shoot a lot of plates. We shot a lot of plates for the battle.
Yep, let's do it. We scanned these areas extensively, both for the terrain and the vegetation.
You know, we draw from the aerial photography, or we go out and shoot it ourselves at a lunch break and come back and process that. It's quite cool, actually, because it's all the pieces of New Zealand kind of chopped together into a shape that we want.
We just repurposed them and put them together again and gradually built the landscape out of different parts of New Zealand, just not in a way that you'd find anywhere if you went looking for them.
So it was always going to be a digital environment. And as the technology progressed, it became clear that it was going to be digital armies as well.
I wanted to have the movement of the armies to be based on real movement. And so Terry Notary, who was doing all of our movement coaching for the actors on set all the way through the live action shoot, he played a big part along with our stunt coordinator, Glenn Boswell, who had done all the stunt work during the live action set. They came into the digital world, onto the motion capture stage. Just as the orcs had been moving or the elves had been fighting in the live action world, then they just carried on doing that with the CGI elves. And then I was able to then come in as the camera operator, and that brings the last level of the sort of the real world into it.
We spent several months really putting together mocap of different battle scenarios, large armies fighting other armies, and actually building the entire battle.
Boom, boom. It's trying to figure out the precision as well as how all the formations are going to work in harmony and unison with only 12 people. We're replicating these performers into 1,000 or thousands.
He's trying to motion capture the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games with 8 people at a time. It's hard.
There's huge number of creatures and dwarfs and orcs and elves, yet when we're on the mocap stage, we're 12 guys. 12 guys did it all.
1, 5, 6, 7, 8, go! Move! 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Action. Okay. See? These guys are suffering for their art.
No actors were actually harmed in this battle. There's this sort of tricky aspect to the whole thing, which is you risk when you have 25,000 troops fighting with each other, you risk having the audience not be able to understand who's who. Terry and Glenn designed fundamentally different rhythms to the motion for each race.
So the movement and the sort of the choreography, if you like, of how these armies move is another weapon that you have at your disposal, if you excuse the pun.
The dwarves had a very sort of like mechanical rhythm in whatever they did.
And the dwarves are on a steady 4 count. They feel like almost like a factory traveling across the lands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's kind of like taking a dump, you know, like the dwarves are just, they just go out and They're like the wall builders. They're like the brick and mortar of the battle.
These guys were solid. They were grounded. They were rooted to the earth.
1, 2, 3, 4.
I think there's probably more to be done with them kind of forming themselves into a little tight kind of tortoise-shaped tank almost.
So you've never seen them fight other than individually before, but it's just something in the DNA of dwarves that at a certain moment they just know to form this unique formation that gives them advantage for that moment in time.
With the dwarves, we wanted to kind of create that real shield wall look where they could be running and then very quickly coalesce into this very striking, strong shield wall, which is a typical kind of Viking or Anglo-Saxon idea that you'd have literally a wall of shields being formed by the front ranks.
Possibly the Macedonian phalanx is the best known of these formations for actually stacking up half a dozen ranks with long spears.
And looking into historical method of you're surrounded by your strength, and as long as one person stays strong, as long as everyone's strong, then you'll triumph. And with the dwarves, that's how they work. They work as a team, they work as a unit.
The thing with dwarves is that they can be very tactical, but things aren't pristine. They're not perfect rank and file like you might see with the elves. So it was important to get variance along the line. So you have these groups of 6 to 10 that would form the shield wall, and that would have nuanced differences between each performer doing it. And then we furthered that in animation. So for example, the way that the pikes stick through the shield wall, there are angle differences and just natural things that would happen in reality.
Orcs, on the other hand, are these they're like swarming schools of piranhas that breaks through walls of elves and dwarves, create a gap, and then pour through.
And the orcs, their rhythm was on 5, so it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it was offset to kind of give you this chaotic rhythm.
You know when a horse runs, how its head surges? It's that feel.
Good. The idea is that the orcs attack by numbers. As they would attack their enemy and their comrades would fall, they would completely disregard their dead. They would stomp on them, step on them. They find a point of weakness and they swarm it.
They don't kind of look out for each other, you know. I guess there's no real kind of preservation instinct there for their fellow soldiers. They just want to kill the goodies, really.
I find that very scary because it's sort of like the kamikaze, where it's like, I don't care, I'm going in, whether I live or die, I'm going to complete my mission.
With respect to the elves that come to the Battle of the Five Armies, you know, there's been a long history in Tolkien's writing of the elves being the dominant military fighting force within the world of Middle-earth.
We're pretty excited to depict that chance to show the elves really let loose in a sustained battle. We did very quickly go back to that prologue sequence.
One of the key things that we saw in the prologue to the Fellowship of the Ring, in the battle on the slopes of Mount Doom, we saw the elves make this very beautifully choreographed action with their swords.
When you see the last alliance fighting, you know, with the elves, with the line of swords scything away, you know, we really wanted to be in that zone.
The elves had this graceful type of movement where they were doing a 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2.
Company, turn.
1.
Very graceful, sort of fluid dynamic to their fighting stance.
Everything with the elves, it's very angular. Everything is made up of triangles, so a lot of trios.
And we designed some really cool stuff where you would have 2 swordsmen to every archer. So the swordsmen would work almost like whirling dervishes, and they would protect their archer. And they would all move as sort of a cohesive group of 3 You see it a lot in the film, actually, on a lot of the close-ups of the battle. You really get this sense of them moving from side to side as they protect the person directly behind them.
The elves' fighting style is almost the equivalent of some form of choreography or dance. They are very swift and very lethal to move through a battlefield like dancers through a crowd.
The elves have always had a slightly Eastern sort of martial arts kind of fighting style.
Karate elf.
There's a particular way that the elves fight. They fight kind of like samurai, mixed between samurai warriors and Greek warriors.
Needed to be a unique fighting style that had some of the qualities of Eastern martial arts in terms of the fluidity of it, but wasn't recognisable.
Holy shit. That was very cool, guys. These guys are good. They're really good.
After we captured an enormous amount of this motion, that's where our animation team come into play. In the previous films, the animators would animate the cameras digitally in each shot.
You have a potential problem when you're doing digital cameras in that they can do things that a real camera can't do.
The most dangerous thing is to have a camera move that doesn't have any purpose. There's always the opportunity to badly animate a camera and have it move in ways that feel unnaturally motivated. But, you know, nearly all the moves that Peter shot himself, I mean, he's physically moving the camera with his body. And so it is, by virtue of that fact, it is a natural camera move.
The fact that he's operating the camera and responding to what he's seeing through the viewfinder gives it kind of a realism and makes it feel human and organic.
The first time I really did it for The Hobbit was on the Desolation of Smaug, all the scenes inside Erebor, basically, with Bilbo and Smaug.
Peter wanted to use the virtual camera work process that he did on the end of Desolation. The one worry when I came on was that it wasn't just Smaug and a couple dwarves that we had to block out, but we had thousands and thousands of characters on the battlefield to do.
So when we looked at Battle of Five Armies and we realized we had scenes with thousands of characters, we were like, well, wait a minute, how are we going to actually animate this?
It's no good showing Pete a battle where you have 5 guys and say, pretend there's an army.
So we brought in a guy named Eric Lagar, and Eric developed this tool called Army Manager, which at its core is a pre-visualization tool.
It allows us to put down very quickly hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, sometimes thousands of characters in the scene.
We can tell it how many army guys it's going to have. We can tell it what the characters inside it are going to be. So right now I've got these dwarves and goats running, and if I play it, it plays at real time, but I can just change that up if I really want. So let me just change that to an orc, and I can make as many of those as I want, and that's how we plan our army attacks.
And the goal was to have video game-like characters running in real time, so then PJ can actually be on the field of battle and run around with the camera and have people surrounding him and be like, oh, here you're fighting and here you're fighting.
Fantastic, we'll just bloody bowl these in one go, no worries.
Pete could actually go and shoot on the mocap stage and actually be able to see a rough representation of thousands of characters fighting.
On the Battle of the Five Armies, I'm standing in a digital virtual environment surrounded by CGI armies. It's just this intuitive, wonderful, creative experience. But only 13 or 14 years ago, I was doing much the same thing as best as I could, except I was using plastic toy soldiers with a lipstick camera.
Back on Lord of the Rings, Peter extensively planned the film a long time before we even shot it.
One of the first things we spent Miramax's money on was buying 40,000 toy soldiers. That's because my thought was, well, we can plan our battles by laying all these things out into formations and, trying to plot all of our battle stuff.
So with Helm's Deep, we had a miniature built, and so he was defining all the moves and what the choreographies could be.
Well, we're probably looking at something like this. I'll press record. And the arrows are coming from here, so it's almost like arrows are going release, flying, thud, 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 into the erection.
At the time, it seemed like, this is really cool. I've got this little camera and I can get these little toy soldiers and look, I can get shots. And I was excited. But when I look back on it now, it's like I'm looking at a Model T Ford or something. It's like it literally is the Dark Ages. And it was only a few years ago.
Now it's done with a virtual camera, with Peter on a stage, looking at the whole battlefield, with him in the middle of it and flying to every location he wants for the battle, where we really see the fighting that's happening. And it still has a realism to it because it has that human element controlling it.
I'm getting better. I was able to weave around and to duck things and to get out of the way, to really be a combat photographer in the middle of a battle, reacting to the physical world around me, trying to stay alive, essentially, as this battle was sort of playing itself out. And I'm trying to do the shots as neat as I can, but of course I'm not doing them perfectly, and that's the whole point, because that lack of perfection is the real world.
What that means is Peter was no longer sketching out the movie, he was shooting it as if it were live action.
Okay, go for it.
Roll, please.
Some of what I do and some of the time that I spend and the stuff I shoot is like exploratory, really. I mean, I'm literally looking around in this virtual world to find anything that really works.
It was great getting him on the stage and getting the camera he wanted, not having to go back and forth, but unfortunately, there's only one director.
I mean, the degree of progress depends on really how complicated what we're shooting is, combined with how good I shoot it, really. Okay, cut it.
Towards the end of the film, I mean, he was shooting the whole movie himself. It was like he was making a home movie again, but at this ridiculously large scale.
I think it takes him back to his roots as a low-budget filmmaker who had to do everything himself. I think he really enjoys grabbing the camera and shooting.
You guys are not violent enough, that's your problem. You are not violent enough. You're little gentle lambs, and you should probably be knitting and not doing violent movies.
When we got to the real hand-to-hand fighting, we could do that with digital characters, and it could be much more violent and much more visceral than we were ever able to do in the past.
We were constantly working on increasing the level of violence and desperation in the fighting. Peter really wanted it to feel like a bloody war.
It's got to feel like there's violence. There's utter rageful violence.
So we're just recording these guys for the Battle of Five Armies. We want to try and get different sounds.
At the moment, we're gearing up so we can bash the crap out of them safely.
We recorded a reenactment group. It was a small group, maybe only 10 people, but sometimes it's nice to get a small contained group of people because you can make that feel bigger. You can expand it using our software and that sort of thing. We got lots and lots of stuff. They were great building blocks. There's something about getting a group of people together in armour, with swords, running around with that weight on them, their breath. Get in a circle and actually, if all of you did it, and just sort of have a bit of a ruckus around. There's an authenticity to recording something like that. You get the real thing, instantly you've got something that feels like a battle.
And finally, pizza! Yeah.
Probably the most powerful asset in the Orc army are their war beasts, as Azog refers to them. They're trolls, and they play a huge part in the battle because they're so powerful and they can cast aside dwarves and elves with ease.
In much the same way that Middle-earth is populated by many different types of orcs. The same can be said of the trolls. We've seen in the course of the movies many, many different types of trolls.
They have a rich history in Peter's films of Middle-earth.
For the Battle of Five Armies, Peter wanted to populate the battle with new trolls. One of the possibilities that sprang to mind was the opportunity to investigate the Ologhai.
Tolkien created this unique race of trolls, the Ologhai, that we ultimately saw in the final battle of The Return of the King.
The Ologhai are the equivalent to trolls of what the Uruk-hai are to orcs.
I don't take orders from orc maggots.
These are super trolls. These are bigger, much more dangerous trolls.
And here they come again into the Battle of the Five Armies.
Peter wanted the trolls to not just be grunts. He wanted to try to get them to be more part of the battle.
Peter visualized them being like massive war machines, like siege weapons.
Peter Franophilippa had very specific briefs when it came to certain trolls. There were elements of them that needed to be aimed towards very specific purposes.
We did some work on their function. Trolls that are kind of catapult trolls. They have these huge kind of siege engines strapped to their backs.
You know, putting the catapults on the backs of trolls, you're now creating essentially a Middle-earth version of the tank.
One of my favorite trolls in the whole show is the guy that just literally goes and runs into the wall with his big head.
So this is an idea for a character that Peter's asked for specifically. We call him the battering troll. As you can see, he's got a large amount of iron and stone strapped to him. He's built and bred for one purpose, and that's to bridge walls.
I mean, what can you say? And you can try one more if you want, just so we have one.
Yeah.
3, 2, 1, action.
Try to get both your feet up in the air for a moment and then just come back down as you naturally would. And okay, cool. That was pretty funny, wasn't it, that one?
That's pretty good.
I thought that was funny.
There's one troll in particular that Peter really liked the look of, which has been nicknamed Stumpy.
Stumpy was one of the giant trolls, and I think Andrew Baker designed that one. And it was a pretty interesting design, and when we first saw it, it's like, really? That doesn't really look like something from Middle-earth.
I did a drawing when we were trying to be really different. I think I did it initially with a really big fish mouth and these sort of googly eyes, and I had him in a sort of white to blue color palette that had no arms, and it just had these sort of chains with a mace at the end of it. Just was quite different. And I think Pete quite liked how it stuck out in the battlefield, and so eventually we started thinking about this guy. Well, maybe he's got rings on his back and the guys hang on and catch him for a ride.
This poor big troll, and how he was just tortured.
He's blind. I mean, the poor man's blind. But his eye sockets are sewn shut. But that's because he doesn't have any eyes. So there's no point in having eyelids.
You're terrible.
And his driver just tugs at his eye sockets to steer him around. He's one of those guys born to bad luck, really, isn't he?
And then for his feet, I remember Pete didn't want him to have legs, because originally he did have legs.
There's risk that its Achilles tendons can be slit by the enemy, bringing it down. How do you stop that? By chopping the legs off and creating these leg extensions in steel.
And I said, oh, this poor guy. And so he said, well, let's come up with a design to make some like extensions on there, like a prosthetic kind of thing, but have it so that it's also a weapon. And we would get our heads together and figure out, all these different types of blades and things we can stick on there. And one of them was just like a big ball that had all these spikes and stuff on it.
Azog has exploited the virtues of these huge animals. Some of them are willing and some of them just driven into it. It's a testament to what he can throw at the enemy.
The superiority of Azog's technique is obvious because he is winning the battle.
Once the dwarves were really being pressed back and looked on the verge of defeat, that would be the point at which Thorin and the dwarves would kind of rush out and change the course of the battle.
How do 13 dwarves suddenly turn a great battle? How do you tell that piece of story and make it feel real?
It was too hard. We were defeated by it. We just couldn't think of a way to do that. But you are expecting that these 13 dwarves are going to somehow turn the battle. You don't really know how, but somehow they'll find a way to do something that no one else is thinking of.